The city was asleep when the system began to close. At 2:17 a.m., downtown Minneapolis looked exactly the way it always did at that hour. Dark office towers, empty intersections, traffic lights cycling for no one. The kind of stillness that convinces people power rests during the night. It doesn't. It just moves quietly. There were no sirens, no emergency convoys, no visible show of force. Unmarked vehicles slid into position along government service roads, underground garages, and loading zones reserved for after-hours maintenance. Headlights went dark blocks away. Doors opened softly. Radios stayed silent. FBI and DEA teams moved in mixed formations, deliberately structured so no single unit could see the entire picture unfolding around the city. This wasn't an arrest, not yet. This was containment. At the same minute, identical actions were happening across multiple locations tied to the same legal ecosystem. Financial compliance offices, data centers contracted under public service agreements, administrative suites that had passed inspections for years without raising a single red flag. These weren't criminal hideouts. They were pillars of legitimacy. Inside one secured building adjacent to the state government complex, access badges still worked. That detail mattered. No forced entry, no broken locks. The system accepted them as authorized. That's when agents knew they weren't stepping into hostile territory. They were stepping into something that had been allowed to exist. The air inside was cold, filtered, processed, too clean for a space that was supposed to be dormant overnight. Server racks hummed behind unmarked walls. Screens glowed with dashboards that hadn't been shut down for the night because they were never meant to sleep. At 2:29, the first financial freeze executed. Not one account, not a raid on cash. Entire categories of transactional authority were suspended at once. Grant approvals, contract extensions, emergency discretionary funds. The goal wasn't to seize money, it was to remove permission. Across the city, systems hesitated. Transfers queued but didn't complete. Automated renewals failed silently. Compliance departments wouldn't understand what was happening for hours. But the effect was immediate. Something that had been moving continuously for years had just lost its ability to move at all. That's when the name surfaced, not announced, not shouted, just confirmed across multiple independent data streams that suddenly aligned. The Minnesota Attorney General. By the time that confirmation reached federal command, the operation had already passed the point of reversal. This wasn't a question of guilt or innocence yet. This was about architecture, about understanding how a legal authority at the highest level could function as a structural load-bearing point inside a much larger system. Agents didn't rush the office. They didn't need to. At 2:41, evidence teams entered a private suite linked to administrative overflow, an innocuous space on paper, filing cabinets, conference tables, diplomas on the wall, nothing that looked like a crime scene. Behind one panel, a compact secure storage unit opened. Inside were sealed containers of cash, clean, counted, bundled with precision that suggested routine, not panic. Initial tallies crossed 7 figures quickly. The final number would come later. What mattered more was how the money was labeled, not personally, not illegally, administratively. Each bundle was tied to case references, discretionary approvals, and delayed enforcement decisions that appeared unrelated until viewed together. This wasn't theft, it was redirection. Money didn't disappear, it flowed. At 2:58, the second phase initiated. Across Minnesota, coordinated actions triggered at once. Attorneys, financial managers, policy intermediaries, people who never carried drugs or weapons, but whose signatures controlled outcomes. Doors opened quietly. Phones were taken without resistance. Questions were answered cautiously, often with the same phrase. I followed procedure. By 3:04, the number was confirmed. $10 million, not hidden offshore, not laundered through exotic channels. It had moved entirely inside the system, approved, justified, documented, clean enough to survive audits, invisible enough to scale. That was when federal command understood this wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was governance being used as infrastructure. At 3:11, the arrest order was prepared. No press, no cameras, no statement drafted. Because the most dangerous part of what had just been uncovered wasn't the money. It was the realization that for years, nothing about this operation required secrecy. It only required trust, and trust had done the rest. By the time the sun began to rise over Minneapolis, the Attorney General was still inside the building, unaware that every system that had protected him no longer responded. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 would not wait. By the time dawn reached the upper floors of the city, the system was already reacting, not with panic, with adjustment. At 5:06 a.m., internal alerts propagated through channels most people never see. Compliance software, case management platforms, budget reconciliation tools. Nothing labeled emergency. Nothing flagged as criminal. Just permissions failing quietly. Approvals that had always cleared now stalled. Processes that depended on a single signature began looping without resolution. That delay was the tell. Inside the Federal Command Center, analysts didn't watch streets, they watched behavior. When authority disappears, systems reveal their true dependencies. And this one had a rhythm that was suddenly breaking. By 5:19, secondary actors began moving, not fleeing, repositioning. Calls went out from private numbers registered to legal consulting firms. Calendar invites were canceled. Secure cloud folders were accessed simultaneously from different locations, too coordinated to be coincidence. Documents weren't deleted, they were duplicated, copied into spaces designed to survive disruption. That told investigators everything they needed to know. This wasn't a lone official skimming money, this was a network that assumed resilience, a structure designed to survive exposure by redistributing responsibility before consequences arrived. At 5:27, the first warrants cleared, not for arrests, for observation. Across Minnesota, federal teams entered offices tied to policy execution rather than enforcement. Grant review boards, procurement auditors, regulatory liaisons embedded inside nonprofits and private firms with public mandates. These were places where paperwork moved faster than scrutiny. Inside one such office in St. Paul, agents found a live case dashboard still updating. No personal notes, no incriminating messages. Just timelines, delays logged as administrative review, additional consideration, equity compliance. Each pause aligned with a known investigation elsewhere in the state. Cases didn't die, they aged out. At 5:41, the pattern became undeniable. Every major enforcement failure over the last 5 years shared the same bottleneck. Evidence suppressed for technical reasons. Hearings postponed until witnesses relocated. Jurisdictional conflicts introduced just long enough for statutes to expire. No overt interference, no illegal orders, just time. And time, applied correctly, is decisive. By 6:02, financial analysts completed a parallel reconstruction. The $10 million wasn't payment, it was lubrication. Funds routed into consultancies, research initiatives, legal review panels, entities that produced reports instead of results. Each expenditure was defensible on its own. Together, they formed a shield. Money didn't buy verdicts, it bought delay. At 6:18, a second number surfaced, not seized, estimated. Hundreds of millions. That was the downstream value of cases that never concluded. Assets never frozen, networks never disrupted. Not stolen money, protected money, the kind that stays in circulation because no one ever arrives with authority to stop it. By 6:33, command made the call. Phase 2 would escalate, simultaneously. Across multiple counties, arrests began, not of high-profile officials, but of intermediaries, legal advisors, financial controllers, policy consultants whose names never appeared in headlines, but whose access made outcomes predictable. There was no resistance. Most complied immediately. Some even appeared relieved. By 6:51, one detainee said it out loud during processing. "We thought this was how it worked." That sentence spread quickly through the room, because it explained everything. This network didn't see itself as criminal, it saw itself as procedural, operating within the margins of discretion that the system itself had created. It didn't break laws loudly, it bent them quietly, repeatedly, until the shape of enforcement changed. At 7:12, the Minnesota Attorney General was formally notified. No accusation yet, no charges read, just a statement of fact. His discretionary authority had been suspended pending federal review. For the first time in years, the office that decided which cases moved forward had no ability to decide anything at all. The reaction was minimal, measured, a request for counsel, a question about timelines. No outrage, no shock. That calm was the final confirmation. This wasn't a man caught off guard. It was a man whose system had failed him. By mid-morning, the consequences reached beyond Minnesota. Federal agencies in other states began checking their own records, not for money, but for patterns. Delays that made no sense. Cases that evaporated without explanation. The same language, the same administrative justifications. What they were seeing wasn't corruption spreading outward. It was replication. And replication only happens when a model works. At 9:04, the Attorney General was taken into custody, quietly, no cameras, no spectacle. Inside a government building that still smelled of coffee and printer toner, federal agents executed the arrest with procedural precision. No resistance, no statements. As he was escorted out, one question was asked. How many offices did you freeze? The answer took longer than anyone liked, because by then, investigators understood something colder than guilt or innocence. This operation hadn't been designed to commit crimes. It had been designed to make crimes unnecessary. And Phase 3 would reveal just how much of the system had learned to depend on that silence. By late morning, the silence began to spread, not on the streets, in the systems. Case queues that had always refreshed now stalled. Automated reminders stopped escalating. Deadlines that once rolled forward without friction froze exactly where they were. To anyone outside the machinery, it looked like a technical hiccup. To investigators watching from inside, it looked like structural failure. This was the moment the network revealed itself. At 10:22 a.m., federal auditors initiated parallel access requests across multiple agencies. Nothing invasive, nothing dramatic. Just routine pulls, historical approvals, deferred actions, discretionary overrides. Individually boring, together devastating. The same signatures surfaced again and again. Not always the attorney generals, sometimes deputies, sometimes advisory committees, sometimes independent ethics panels funded through auxiliary budgets. The pattern wasn't authority concentrated at the top. It was authority distributed just enough to blur accountability. That was the design. By 10:47, investigators understood why no one had panicked earlier. This system had never depended on a single office. It depended on alignment, on shared assumptions about what was normal, about what was too complex to challenge, about which cases were sensitive, fragile, or not the right moment. No one had to give illegal orders. Everyone just had to agree to wait. At 11:03, financial seizures began, not cash raids, account freezes. Consulting firms tied to regulatory review suddenly lost access to operating funds. Non-profit intermediaries discovered their grants suspended mid-cycle. Legal contractors whose role was to advise enforcement agencies found their retainers locked pending review. Phones started ringing, not to investigators, between the intermediaries themselves. The first real movement came from people who had never expected to be noticed. Mid-level administrators, budget officers, policy analysts whose names had never appeared in indictments. They began requesting meetings, voluntarily, quietly. They weren't confessing, they were clarifying. At 11:41, one meeting transcript shifted the tone of the entire operation. "We didn't stop cases," the individual said. "We slowed them." That was the instruction. Instruction from whom? No direct answer. Just a phrase repeated in different forms across interviews. This came from above the enforcement layer. By noon, federal teams began reconstructing the shadow chain. Not a hierarchy, a gradient. Pressure didn't flow down through commands. It flowed sideways through incentives, through funding priorities, through reputational risk. Offices learned which outcomes were rewarded and which stalled careers. Over time, enforcement adapted without being told to. That adaptation was the real crime. At 12:18, evidence from seized servers confirmed it. Internal memos didn't mention cartels or trafficking. They mentioned community impact, optics, strategic patience, language designed to justify inaction while sounding responsible. One document summarized it perfectly. Premature enforcement may undermine long-term stability. Stability for whom was never specified. By 1244, the scope expanded again. Cases dismissed years earlier were re-examined. Evidence logs compared. Witness timelines cross-referenced. In dozens of instances, law enforcement had done everything right, only for prosecutions to collapse later inside administrative channels. This wasn't sabotage, it was erosion, and erosion leaves no fingerprints. At 1309, federal leadership faced the uncomfortable conclusion. Arresting the Attorney General had not dismantled the network. It had exposed the surface. Beneath it was something harder to prosecute. A culture that treated enforcement as negotiable. A belief that outcomes could be managed quietly if enough time passed. That belief had kept tens of millions flowing. It had protected entire supply chains without anyone ever touching a shipment. By early afternoon, the question shifted, not who was guilty, but how many decisions, perfectly legal on paper, had combined to make criminal enforcement optional, and how far that logic had spread. At 1402, Phase 3 began. Not with arrests, with revocation. Discretionary powers suspended across multiple offices. Emergency federal oversight triggered in areas that had never expected it. Case authority reassigned, timelines compressed, delays removed as an option. The system resisted, not violently, but procedurally. Appeals were filed, jurisdiction questioned, protocol cited. But for the first time, those tools weren't slowing anything down. They were being ignored. By 1437, investigators knew they had crossed a line the network hadn't planned for. The model assumed gradual pressure. It had never accounted for simultaneous loss of discretion. And as the afternoon wore on, the consequences of that miscalculation began to surface, quietly, methodically, and far beyond Minnesota. Because once discretion disappears, systems built on delay have nothing left to hide behind. By nightfall, the machinery stopped pretending it could adapt. What had once relied on delay now faced deadlines. What had survived through discretion now encountered fixed authority. Systems designed to bend quietly had no muscle left when pressure no longer moved in sequence. At 1908, the final warrants were executed, not loudly, not publicly. Offices emptied after hours, residences secured without cameras, digital access revoked before conversations could start. The remaining figures identified as structural enablers, policy gatekeepers, funding arbitrators, enforcement liaisons, were taken into custody or suspended pending indictment. No resistance, no statements. Most had already understood the direction hours earlier. This phase was never about spectacle. It was about permanence. By 2011, the financial picture finalized. $10 million seized or frozen wasn't the headline number. It was the proof of concept. The money hadn't been hidden offshore or buried in shells. It had lived inside legitimate frameworks, consulting fees, compliance budgets, advisory contracts, protected by complexity rather than secrecy. Every dollar had moved legally. That was the problem. Overnight, federal task forces expanded their mandate. Not just Minnesota, not just one office. Any jurisdiction where enforcement outcomes had shown statistically improbable patterns. Cases delayed just long enough to expire. Audits softened without explanation. Prosecutions redirected toward alternative resolutions. Patterns don't lie, they accumulate. By the third morning, Minneapolis woke up unchanged and destabilized. Buildings stood, courts opened, press briefings spoke of ongoing reviews and process improvements. But entire layers of authority were gone. Emails went unanswered, decision chains dead-ended. Projects stalled without anyone able to approve the next step. The absence was louder than arrests. Inside federal briefings, the final assessment took shape. This wasn't a corruption case in the traditional sense. There were no envelopes exchanged in parking garages. No threats whispered over phones. The system had been compromised without ever being broken. It had been optimized. Optimized for patience. Optimized for reputational safety. Optimized to avoid responsibility without ever refusing it outright. That optimization had protected networks far more effectively than violence ever could. The Attorney General remained silent. So did most of those detained. Their silence wasn't strategy, it was habit. They had spent years operating within rules, believing outcomes could always be managed later. Later never came. Weeks after the arrests, analysts were still working through seized data. Not messages ordering crimes, but documents explaining frameworks, how discretion was justified, how oversight could be softened without objection, how legitimacy could be leveraged as armor. The most unsettling files weren't illegal, they were persuasive, and that was the final conclusion. Buried deep in an internal report, never meant for headlines. This wasn't about one official, it wasn't about one state, it wasn't even about one network. It was about what happens when systems meant to enforce the law become skilled at postponing it. Because when criminal activity no longer needs protection, only patience, the threat isn't who breaks the rules, it's who decides, quietly and repeatedly, that enforcing them can wait.